Hello, thank you. I would like to start by thanking the organizers who pulled off the miraculous 2 years running of pandemic, and we're still here today. So thank you very much. I'd also like to say that I'm thrilled to speak to you today in particular. I'm often called upon to speak to my industry, which is the language industry, which is very much like preaching to the choir. And what I'm really excited about is talking to the thinkers and the researchers and the policymakers and the practitioners in health, because this is a really important message. And it's what I believe is language is the single most important thing that almost no one is talking about when it comes to global equity in healthcare. So what's language got to do with it? Keep your distance and wear a mask. Breast is best. Follow diarrhea with fluids. Don't smoke. Quite often, healthcare is not just what's being delivered by doctors and nurses. It's information. And when information is in the wrong language, this is what it looks like. It doesn't exist. Let me tell you a little bit about my journey to start Translators Without Borders and how I realized just what a great big glaring gap there is. And that I'm really, really happy to be talking to you about today. I founded Traducteurs Sans Frontières in 1993, and we were mostly donating translations in European languages to European nonprofits. We wondered why no one was asking for Dinka or Gujarati or Nepali. They weren't asking for the languages that were outside the power languages, our languages. I thought, that can't be right. I mean, can there really be no need? So I went to Africa. I went to this village called Thicke, which is halfway between Nairobi and Mombasa. And in Thicke, in this village, I met 35 AIDS orphans. This is Muthoki. She was 10 years old at the time. She was one of the three of the 35 who was also HIV positive. So not only did she lose her parents, but she herself was HIV positive. And I was trying to understand why people were and are still being infected with AIDS when we know perfectly well how to prevent it. So I went to the clinic in this village. As you know, healthcare workers are the front line of healthcare in the developing world. Arguably, we're hoarding vaccines, and we're also arguably hoarding the doctors and nurses. So where there's a super big dearth of doctors and nurses, the burden is being shouldered by community healthcare workers. So I was interested in how they get their information, how they take care of their patients, how they're trained. And in fact, everything I saw in that clinic, the posters, the pamphlets, even that fabulous resource, the Community Health Workers Manual, really very good, locally relevant material, but it was all in English. And the healthcare worker couldn't communicate with me without an interpreter. That was my first worry. As I was leaving that village that day, I saw this this countrywide AIDS campaign, zip it or use a condom. Zip it or use a condom. Who's getting that? Who are they talking to? In fact, I later found out that that was approved by the donor, and that happens very often where the donors have a hand in approving the materials and they want to understand them. Maybe what they're not thinking about as importantly is what are the target population's understanding. Still trying to figure this out, I went to a conference organized by the African Union in Ethiopia, and I met Sozingo. And he said something that really kind of knocked me on my butt. He said, if you go to the rural areas in Africa, speaking English, French, Portuguese, you are speaking to yourselves. The former colonial languages are spoken by a very small minority elite, not the majority of the people in Africa. I'm speaking a lot today about Sub-Saharan Africa because that's an area that I know best, but it's also the same in other countries. For example, India, we do think everybody speaks English, but did you know that only 16% of Indians speak English? So it's really important how we're addressing people with health messages, especially if we're talking about leveling the playing field in global health. After this trip, I decided to start Translators Without Borders. So I'd already founded Traducteurs Sans Frontières. I started Translators Without Borders as a US nonprofit. Today, it's the largest translation nonprofit in the world. Up to date, 80 million words have been translated for nonprofit organizations with 69,000 language volunteers, speaking 220 languages, thanks, at a native level, and translating into 3,000 unique language combinations. Today, Translators Without Borders has an executive team that runs it. And this team is involved in crisis relief, working in many refugee camps, in development and preparedness for earthquakes and natural disasters, capacity building and advocacy, which is what I'm doing here today. But we have had damn few real chances to be outside our world. And so I'm really happy to be in your role, because I think this is a super important conversation. These are some of the global partners of Translators Without Borders, some of the nonprofits they work with, some of the technology companies, and the grassroots organizations. Epidemic and pandemics are very much on our minds today. So I wanted to say that inside every epidemic, there's an infodemic. In aid situations and in healthcare, when aid is information and it's in the wrong language, that aid is not happening. With healthcare, if healthcare is information, it's in the wrong language, it's just not happening. In the first epidemic that Translators Without Borders was involved in was the Ebola epidemic. And that taught us so many lessons that I'd like to go through a few of those lessons with you today. But this is the most frightening of all messages, of all the information that we received about this. If people had been given proper messages, all this could have been avoided. This is from the MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, coordinator of global health in the Ebola crisis. So what went wrong? People were getting infected, even though we knew how to prevent it. There were very good signs and posters and billboards. They were in English, of course, in the English-speaking countries. In West Africa, they were in French for the French-speaking countries like Guinea, and yet only 16 to 20% of people in those countries were speaking the languages. That was obviously a big problem, if you can't comprehend the messages. But there was an even bigger problem that we didn't realize until we started studying it. Nelson Mandela really articulated it nicely. If you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart. And in fact, in the Ebola epidemic, we were asking people to change deeply held cultural traditions. We were telling them in a foreign language, don't hold your sick child, don't wash the body of your loved one who's departed. So these extremely emotional messages were coming in a foreign language. So if you can imagine, if someone came into the States with really excellent healthcare information in Spanish or French, I mean, how many people is it going to convince at a really deep level? So we learned a few things. One of them is obviously speaking to people in the right language. Another message was asking people, because not everybody wants information in the same way. You don't have the same degree of literacy from one country to another. You don't have the same traditions. Some people, when questioned, would say, yes, we want written material. Some people would say, no, we'd rather have a radio show. I listen to radio all the time. Some people wanted to see a video on their smartphones, not smartphones, on their feature phones. There were so many different ways that people wanted to receive information. And if we want to be effective, then the first thing we want to know is, how do they want to receive information? And translation isn't the only solution, because look at all these languages. There are so many languages, 25 in Sierra Leone, over 40 in Guinea, over 30 in Liberia. And people have different levels of understanding of their official language. So we did some more research, and what we found is that if you could get the regional languages, you could actually get more than with the colonial languages. For example, in Guinea, French, 15 to 25% of people speak French, but you can add another 32% with Fula and another 30% with Malinke. So if you can target the languages, obviously there's 6,000 to 7,000 languages. And those of us who care about global equity and global health information, then obviously we want to get the language right, but no one's got the capacity for 6,000 to 7,000 languages. In my experience in Sub-Saharan Africa, the people are incredible linguists. You've got people who speak their village language. If their parents came from different tribes, they speak their mom's and their dad's language. Then they speak the regional language, and quite often in third or fourth place, they're speaking the official language of the country. So we have a great opportunity to start hitting those middle languages. Like, for example, Hausa, which I seem to have a whole bunch of slides about Hausa today, is my language of the day. There are 52 million speakers of Hausa in Nigeria. It's a really big regional language, and I think that we can hit more people with these big languages. I'd like to talk about community health workers for a second, because Africa, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa has 25% of the world's disease burden, but only 2 to 3% of its doctors and nurses. It's really important that people have the empowerment of health information. That's the first thing. Right now, people do have smartphones, or I keep saying smartphones, feature phones. They can access all of human knowledge in the palm of their hands if it's in the right language. We also need to make sure that community health workers are properly trained. So in this Translators Without Borders study, it was really quite shocking. Community health workers are normally trained in the big power languages, English or French or Portuguese. And in this study, we looked at a group before they had any training. These were Ebola healthcare workers, community healthcare workers who are going to go out into the field. So they had their baseline was 8% of the questions that they got correct. One group was trained in English, the other was trained in Swahili. Swahili is actually the native language of almost nobody, but it's a really good regional language. So when they were trained in English, they got 16% of the questions correct, which is super scary to me. When you think of these are the people, these are the frontline people, these are people who are going door to door, and they're only understanding 16% of the material. And with Swahili, it went up to 92%. Let's go back to Kenya. This is the Kibera slum, which is the second largest slum in Africa. And this is where HIV is at twice the national average. I went to a healthcare clinic there, and I saw where the impact of where governments are strong and governments are weak. Because in these, those medicines there, I started looking at the packaging, and they were translated into all of our languages, into English and French and Spanish and German and Finnish, but not one single African language. This is a government issue, but it is so important. I would hear horror stories of people who didn't understand how to take their medications. There was one lady who had taken 11 pills because she'd missed 11 days, and that didn't end well. This as well is a really important language issue. I met this group of women who are sex workers who were transitioning to become community health workers. Their big focus was sexual reproductive health. And they were working in Kabir. Their goal in life was to share that information with the women in the slum. But they said to us, we would like to learn how to translate because all our brochures are in English. People take them, they walk out, and they throw them to the ground. They throw them to the ground. This is the same group being trained in how to translate. And very, very excited, enthusiastic group. As an anecdote, the Ministry of Health had given us a classroom, but they were dragging their heels on making it ready for us. So we were borrowing a classroom that was right below the Ministry of Health offices. And the women doing the training were so excited, debating on this word or that word, that all of a sudden the Ministry of Health found our classroom and got us out of there. We next went to the Misi Islands, where a group of school teachers had asked us to, again, help them translate. In this case, actually, we were teaching them subtitling because in the Masai Mara, I believe it was, there had never been any single video ever translated on health into the Ma language, never once. And so they were really excited about this. In fact, the lady, Mary, on the right, who was kind of quiet during the session, just before we broke for lunch, she gave a very, very long prayer. It was quite adamant, and I thought very strong. She's definitely asking for something with a bit of a push to it. And so I said, listen, I'm sorry, I have to ask, what were you praying for? And she said, well, we wanted to finish our session, so we were praying the internet connection wouldn't go down. This is super important. These women are working, these school teachers were working on female genital mutilation. That's a huge issue in the Maasai lands. It wasn't an issue in the Kamba lands that we looked at earlier, but in the Maasai lands, it's a big issue. And the problem is that many girls die from it, but they don't always die at once. They may die later during childbirth, so people don't make the connection. And the school teachers really wanted to get that information across. They had an excellent brochure about female genital mutilation and the chances of dying, the risks to your health, and the difficulties in childbirth, but it was in English and people were using. Remember in Kibera, they were throwing the brochures out onto the ground. Here, same story, they were in English, they were using them for fire starter. And I guess that's what I want to say today is, if we're giving health information in the wrong language, that's what it's good for, fire starter. In sub-Saharan Africa, 1 in 8 children die before the age of 5, and mostly it's from diarrhea. I don't know if you read the statistic once that the biggest cause of death of children in South Africa was swimming pool deaths for white children and diarrhea for Black children. People don't need to die from diarrhea. You don't die from diarrhea, you die from the consequences. A very great man who unfortunately has passed on, named Nad Wadwani, was telling me about a village in India that he was working in with the local women. He had the mother and child trust. So in this village, he went a certain day and the women were all in mourning. And he said, what was wrong? Well, one of the village women, her daughter had died in the night of diarrhea. Well, he went to her house to give his condolences. And in her kitchen, he saw salt, sugar, and clean water. The mother had everything she needed to save her daughter, but she didn't have the information. And ironically, there was actually a poster in the village, but it was in English. In the refugee camps, language is also a problem. As I was saying earlier, that every community has its own desires, its own ways they need to communicate, their own levels of literacy. And preferences, and it's important to ask. So this Translators Without Borders study was looking at preferences. 90% understood little or no English. That's massive. 88% preferred to have information in their own language, and 64% preferred written material because they said spoken words fly away. Every community is different, and it's important to know what works. Isn't it what this is all about? Is how are we going to move the needle if we're not doing what works? And the problem with disasters is that the people most likely to suffer from one are the ones least likely to speak a European language. I think that we would be doing a disservice to not include technology in this discussion. I love this, this kiosk on the left. For people who don't have electricity, they can go there and charge up their cell phones. The innovations, many countries in the developing world have a young and innovative population, and technology is really opening doors for them and for us in terms of reaching people with healthcare messages. Feature phones today are so cheap. You can buy one at the airport for $35, a phone that you can use to show videos. And videos are such a great way of reaching people. The internet, of course, is our scalable platform, but the internet is only as big as your language is. So you might have 500,000 pages for 5 million Norwegian speakers and a few dozen pages for the 50 million Hausa speakers. One of my favorite projects is this Wikipedia project, just because of the scalability and their mission. Imagine a world in which every single person on the planet is given free access to the sum of all medical knowledge. What a goal is that? If any of you are doctors or nurses, practitioners in this room, this is a fabulous project. What they're doing is they're editing Wikipedia articles to make sure they're accurate, the medical ones, the articles that are getting millions upon millions of page views every month. You'd be surprised at the gaps. Even in Hungarian, you're seeing major articles in cancer that haven't been translated. So Translators Without Borders has also been working to get those really critical Wikipedia articles that anybody can access. And you know, they can access them when the internet is live, but they can also access them through new technology that I'm seeing. For example, there's something called Kiwix, which will give you all of Wikipedia on a USB key, and then you can take it into a classroom. People can surf Wikipedia as if they had an internet connection, but it works without internet connection. There are several options for internet where there is no internet. Translators Without Borders is working on a number of different projects, different ways of reaching people. Recording radio infomercials, for example, is one way to get healthcare information to people. Also machine translation. I believe it was mentioned earlier, machine translation is great. That's what we do, right? If we need to access an article that's in a different language, well, we can use machine translation, but there's only around 70 machine translation engines in Google, for example, which is the leader. And there are 6,000 to 7,000 languages in the world. So we need to do a lot better. Translators Without Borders has been building engines for these neglected languages where you've got millions upon millions of speakers, but still aren't big enough to get a machine. Well, we have a machine translation engine for Norwegian, I'm sure. But but to build a machine translation engine, you need a lot of bilingual corpora. It's not that easy. So you need to beforehand translate maybe 50,000 sentences so you can start to build the engine. That's another important project. We also have chatbots that are answering people's questions in their own language. Okay, because more people die from lack of information than lack of medication, I have a wish list that I'm going to end with, and I might be a little over or under time, I'm not sure, but Okay, but I'm going to give you my wish list, because here I am talking to the thinkers and the policymakers and the researchers and the practitioners at home and here today. And what I would love to see is, first of all, more research into the technology that people can use, research into what is effective. Because that's the biggest problem, is that the information transmitted is not effective. We're going back to what was said earlier in Ethiopia. The NGOs are talking to themselves. They've got good intentions, but they're talking to themselves. So research into what languages work, what regional languages can give us the most bang for our buck, can reach the most people, what technology can be brought to bear, whether it's in the camps, in a classroom setting. What delivery mode do people prefer? Do they want oral? Do they want written? Do they want posters? Do they want someone to come and speak to them? What's the best way to reach people? Will they use their feature phones? Terminology is really important. If you're writing for translation, you have to use simple language, partly because not every concept has a translation in other languages, but it's easier for the translator if you use short sentences, simple language. And terminology, once it's been translated, you need to have a second set of eyes on this. For example, in Hausa, it's like I said, it's my language of the day today. In Hausa, the translation of mental health is crazy. So there was an NGO offering services for crazy people. Obviously, that didn't go well. So it's important to get the terminology right in your base language that you're writing in, and also make sure that you've got a check on the other end. And most important of all, I think, is that healthcare workers who are carrying the burden of healthcare in poor countries be trained. It seems like a no-brainer, but they're currently being trained in languages they barely speak. They should be trained in the languages that they understand, that we can engage them. They can provide better healthcare. We can start to work on your ambitious goal of leveling the playing field of global healthcare. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you, everyone on Zoom as well. I'll kindly ask if you have a question, to write your question in the chat. We're just moving around some furniture here. While you write your question in the chat, I am going to quickly stop sharing the screen here so that you can see us perhaps a little bit better. Sorry, forgive me. Okay. And perhaps we can start off to see if anyone in the room has a question that they wanted to start off with. Yes, go ahead. I might repeat it if that's okay, so that we.
Yeah, I do have a question, but I first wanted to say that I really love this presentation and it resonated with me. I have worked for almost 20 years in healthcare delivery for rural or indigenous marginalized populations. And I've had this experience over and over and over again, especially with some indigenous languages that are quite prolific and have been spoken for thousands of years, and there are millions of people who speak them, and there are no materials that are wonderful materials that are available for these people. And so I spend a lot of my time doing translations, picture translations, what you're talking about with the salt and the sugar in the house, in Latin America, it's suero, and doing picture translations for those types of things to save children's lives with that. And so I just really enjoyed your presentation. My question was, how did you stumble upon this kind of work? Were you a linguist or working just in the developing world?
Can I just quickly repeat that? How did you stumble across this type of work? Were you a linguist or did you work in the developing world?
Actually, neither. I'm a Canadian. I came to Paris and I ended up in the language industry. And that piqued my interest in languages globally. so I don't have your medical experience. I'm so interested that you had the same experience, like you said, and I'm repeating it because they might not have heard it, that huge prolific languages with loads of speakers. It was very frustrating for you doing that work when there was no materials in that language. And that you spent your time translating or finding ways to get the information out. Yeah, it's fascinating subject.
I believe you had a question.
Yes, thank you very much. It was really interesting and food for thought. Yes, my case. But I have some questions regarding especially African populations and other areas regarding health care and so on, that it seems go beyond the question of having access to their own language, to the information that would be useful to address their illness and so on. This that according to the information and testimonies of people I know, for instance, missionaries and so on, most of the problems come from cultural issues, superstitions, beliefs, and so on. So, for instance, now against vaccination, and it seems that it's a lot of work that needs to be done to change their minds, their cultural perceptions beyond just the translation issue that is important and plays a role. So I think we need to put more attention to pay more attention to the so-called human factor when we try to address health issues, and not just to technical issues of which medicines would be more effective in which context, but human factor plays a big role. And among human factor, religious beliefs or magical beliefs also are play one of the biggest roles. What is your opinion regarding this?
I think you're absolutely right that, well, first of all, superstition and religion can play a big role in making a roadblock to even going to a doctor in the first place. Yeah, it's major, and even very, very educated people might also say, well, I will go to a Western doctor, but I'm also going to go to my local healer. So that is absolutely true. And I can only think, and that's a great point that you brought up. And I can only think that more information can help, even if it is those human factors, those cultural factors are definitely a big hurdle for anyone working in healthcare, and you will have seen that yourself.
Anyone else have another question or a comment? I'm just looking in the chat here. We've got one, I'm just scroll through, sorry, forgive me for a second. Jen, I think this might be more of a comment than a question. An extremely important topic, an excellent presentation. Thank you. It was really good to be part of this session. If you're on Zoom and you have a question, please type it in the chat. Yeah, my question was sort of linked to how you got into this, but also where to go from here. I know you said that we sort of keep looking at languages, intervening and all this type of thing. But so what are you actually working on next? Do you have a next place that you're going, a next project, a next aim, what's your goal here?
Well, so Translators Without Borders is marching on and doing their work. And what I really want to do is try to get the message out to nonprofits. That's the nonprofits who are in the field, who are delivering health materials, who maybe think because they work with the global elite that there really isn't a language problem. I mean, that for me is advocacy is the important thing.
Yeah, and I like that you connect with so many people who are actually part of the community. They're doing the translation themselves, and you're sort of helping with the tools, but the actual, not the work, that's not the right word, but the joy, the task is being done by the people who are in the communities. Mm-hmm. So that's great.
Definitely.
You wanted to add something?
So kind of two parts, kind of what you were saying. I was going to ask what is it that your organization needs, like to get you to your goals of the goals that your organization has? What is it that you could benefit from anybody else participating? And then secondly, what is the role of some of those larger nonprofits in your partnerships with them? So I saw the IRC and all of those places, and some of the bigger players. And so what is a partnership with one of those organizations look like?
One of the magic things that's happening in some of these big organizations is that they probably were aware of the translation problem before, but it was such a big problem that I don't think that they knew how to approach it. And what's happening now is in these partnerships, they're starting to say, come study, come do some research with us, help people help us figure, we're in Nigeria, we have a refugee camp, are we speaking the right language to the people in the camps? How do we deal with the Rohingya who have a great deal of illiteracy and not a great tradition of a written language? How do we reach people in those situations? So all of those are almost like individual cases, individual challenges, whether it's in a camp or in or with disaster preparedness. They're all projects. I think more awareness and more projects like that where they actually will come to TWB and say, help us with this. And then that becomes a project. I think that starts to move the needle a little bit. And of course, every organization needs donations. Every organization under the sun.
Does anyone else have anything, a comment or a question? I think we might be at that one in the afternoon where I'll just scroll here just in case I've missed anything.
Thank you for the nice comments online.
Yes.
I really appreciate that.
Our guests, our delegates here can see you up on the big screen with these lovely comments behind us. So it's a nice way to finish the session, I think. I just want to thank you for your time. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
And thank you all. We will see you all in the reception shortly here in the room. And you all there, have a nice afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are. Perhaps you can enjoy a drink of some sort, depending on what time zone you're in. Maybe your drink might be tea, but we'll be thinking of you nonetheless, and we'll hopefully see you next year as well. So thank you, everyone.
See you in Johannesburg.
Yeah.